So, Linda, you started with patients who had cerebral palsy, but not long after, families with children with autism also appeared in your clinic. So, could you talk about the transition and the similarities and differences between cerebral palsy and autism?
What was actually happening was we were getting children who were diagnosed with cerebral palsy because of their odd movements. But when I looked at them, they didn't breathe like children with cerebral palsy and they didn't move like children with cerebral palsy. Something else was going on. Another part of the brain must be what was triggering these symptoms. So I began to note that when we improved their diaphragmatic function, there was equally a reduction in their unwanted movements and an improvement in their posture. And then gradually, these children became re-diagnosed with autism because don't forget, we started a long time ago, over 20 years ago. And at that point, to diagnose a child with autism was rather unusual. Then we had a little girl who had a diagnosis of autism. She couldn't walk, not because I realized because she didn't functionally wasn't incapable of walking, but she didn't understand what walking was. And as we worked with her, she became able to walk, but she couldn't understand the difference between a door and a wall. And she certainly couldn't speak. Her mother was very dedicated, and gradually her understanding of the world around her and her ability to speak transformed this little girl whose name was Josie. So Josie was able to go to school with a support worker and became a unusual but delightful child with quite a remarkable quality of life. So that was the beginning of the journey with children with autism, very clear diagnosis. The different location in the brain meant that the children's breathing, because the location in the brain where the damage or disruption, if you like, was the connection between the limbic system and the rest of the brain. So the limbic system is our emotional brain. It helps us to store and access information in a very focused way in relation to emotional charge, right? And also, it's the trigger of arousal, which of course is flight or fight. So these children were living in an emotional world on the edge of flight or fight, or they also could demonstrate the freeze, the ability to just disengage from everything. Now, early infant speech very much relies upon the limbic system to lay down memories of the speech that the child has heard around it before it begins to assemble this speech via its diaphragm to articulate it, and for the speech to be a response to what is going on around, relevant. Many children with autism are able to speak, but they only parrot what, or apparently, it's probably deeper than that, but they can recall the language and phrases that were used typically on a video or a video game, but they can't engage in speech, which is directly to communicate with people who are, in a sense, in the outside world, outside their limbic system. And their movements are also impelled by this because they move emotionally. There is a big muscle that covers our whole body that babies use to communicate, in which you move everything together. It's our emotional muscle. It's connected with emotional breathing up here. Often when you are emotional, you move your arms up and down. This is to help to lift your rib cage to give some diaphragmatic support to otherwise an emotional range of breathing. So as more children came in and I could observe and study the differences in more depth and understand what was involved neurologically, then in a sense, the same protocols were still important to use. In this case, whereas a child with cerebral palsy will have a weak, flat diaphragm, trying to breathe diaphragmatically, but very effortful, the child with autism is more likely to have a narrow but high rib cage because they're breathing here. And the evidence, as well as the evidence from my observation, showed quite clearly that breathing modifies the shape of the rib cage. If you change your breathing pattern, your rib cage will change. So we were aware of that observationally, but again, the literature supported what I was seeing. So it was very interesting that as time went by, it was extremely easy for me to identify the difference between the two groups. Some children, of course, had a mixture of the two. And in fact, the small boy on the video on my website, Hugo, was initially showing a lot of emotional, limbic, the charged symptoms, but they just went. And he was left with a very quite remarkable speech, really, in terms of his vocabulary, which was now no longer limited to within the walls of the limbic system. It connected to the rest of the brain. And diaphragmatic breathing is what connects. You know, if you are overexcited, people will say to you, calm down, because they can see that you're breathing here, and the calming down is breathe again with your diaphragm. A sigh of relief from that stress and tension. And the further difficulty, which obviously compounds the restorative recovery of children with autism, is that if they are constantly breathing up here, they are reinforcing the problem, because there is, for them, most of them are moving a lot. They're driven emotionally to move, but their movement is very disorganized, and it consumes a lot more oxygen than their upper chest breathing can provide for them. Moreover, most brain growth takes place at night when we're asleep and during dream sleep. And dream sleep is essentially, ideally, absolutely only a diaphragmatic movement. It's the diaphragm that is involved singularly in dream sleep, not the intercostal muscles or the upper range. So this would present another problem for them.